So you have not just religious differences, you have stark differences of allegiance. And we also had a long period of violence where great atrocities were committed against people in Northern Ireland. There was an assassination attempt made on the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, which killed a number of people and maimed number of people for life, but thank God did not take her life. And equally, there were random killings of people on the other side, on the Catholic side of the equation, just because they were Catholic. Particular bars were bombed just because most of the customers who drank there were considered to be Catholic and therefore legitimate targets in the eyes of the so-called loyalists. So the divisions were very, very bitter. So a long period was spent trying to find a way of first getting the violence to stop, because until the violence stopped, there really wasn't any hope of people talking to one another, because nobody will negotiate with somebody at the other side of the table if the person on the other side of the table has a gun under the table that they're prepared to produce, and you don't have a gun on your side of the table. That's not an equal negotiation. So we first had to work, Jack Straw was involved in this, work to get the violence stopped, at least temporarily, and then to negotiate a settlement. And we negotiated a settlement which is far from perfect. Essentially what it is a permanent, mandatory coalition. People are free to vote whoever they want into the Assembly in Northern Ireland, but in mathematical proportion to the number of seats they get in the election, they get an equivalent number of ministerial posts, which are voted upon in a very complex series of votes. So, but everybody doesn't get their first choice, but everybody gets some representation in the cabinet. It's far from ideal, because in a sense you have no opposition in such a system. You have opposition within the government, but you don't have any formal opposition to the government. On the other hand, you do have everybody involved. It's slow in making decisions. On the other hand, and I think it's to the credit of the people in Northern Ireland, that they have been able to make substantial reductions in public spending as part of the wider cuts in public spending that had to be made as part of UK government policy, notwithstanding the fact that everybody was in the government in Northern Ireland, and you'd imagine that they just would not make decisions to cut spending when everybody was in the cabinet and there were virtually the possibility of one person saying no and everything stopping. But they didn't find themselves in that situation. They weren't able to make the decisions, notwithstanding the fact that it was a permanent all-party coalition. And they have been able to reduce spending in Northern Ireland, not perhaps as much as David Cameron would want, but quite as considerable amount just the same, and to do it in such a permanent coalition. Now, I don't recommend that to you at all. I don't think it's a particularly good system, but it just shows you that if the need is great enough, human ingenuity is sufficient to find an answer that will get people around the table. Because getting people together around the table and talking and listening and making concessions to one another, that's really the only way that this problem can be solved. To conclude, I just want to say what a privilege it is for me to be here in Nigeria for the first time in my life. I've never been here before. I have really enjoyed the welcome. I have most particularly enjoyed the free speech. The fact that you're prepared to give it as well as take it and learn from one another, that indicates a really strong democracy. And I think you need to apply that in wider areas, and I hope that some of the things that Jack and I have been able to say to you about our experiences, historical experiences in Europe, where we have a lot to learn too, will give you some encouragement for the future. Because if you have a solid democracy, you'll have plenty of investment in this country, and if you have plenty of investment in this country, you'll have plenty of prosperity. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do now, I'm going to make a short summation of what we've discussed so far and add a few comments of my own. Then I'm going to invite the eminent panel to make their comments, 5 minutes each, but they will be at liberty to comment on things that have been said not only by Prime Minister Bruton, but also points raised by Jack Straw or by myself. Then we will have question and answers from the audience. This time the governor is not allowed to ask any questions because he's going to have a right to speak at the end in any case. But I myself have been very, very impressed by what has been said today at this meeting. I travel all over the world speaking to different audiences, not only in Africa, but in the Far East, in China, United States, Europe, many, many places where these same issues to do with democracy, transparency, and corruption are discussed and debated. And it's absolutely true what our two speakers have said. There's no perfect system anywhere. Everywhere there is a project in creation to try to create a more transparent, less corrupt, more democratic society. And I think that although there have been many, many critics, of course, of what has happened here in Nigeria, Nigerians are their own worst or best critics, there has been real progress here. Because for 24 years, no, let me change that, for 34 years, I've been tramping all over Africa, involved in all kinds of difficult situations. I began my life monitoring the ceasefire and the independence elections in Zimbabwe. I went to live in Zambia in the 1980s when the ANC were in exile at that point in time. I was part of the cleanup in Uganda after the fall of Idi Amin. I trained the Foreign Service in Eritrea after the overthrow of the Stalinist dictatorship in that country. In Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi was one of my students. I've been involved in South Sudan. I've been involved now in the cleaning up of the terrible mess in Libya. Everywhere you see desolation, despair, but what you see here in Nigeria, something which has really impressed me, is dynamism. And with this dynamism, you can take this country forward in a way that has eluded many of your neighbors here in Africa. But it's very much a dynamism which has to be turned to constructive purposes. I think what our speakers have done today is to have shared their experiences with you about how they try to transform their societies into more just, more democratic, less corrupt societies. Each of the speakers has laid down the kinds of legislation that they were involved in trying to pass, the kinds of initiatives that they took when they were leaders of government, what they've tried to learn from other examples in the world. They've tried to illustrate your dynamics and your problems with their dynamics and their problems and their ways of coming out of their problems. I think it's been a very, very constructive engagement today. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have faith in what you are trying to do. The next engagement I have in Africa will be in May in South Africa, where I'll be going to observe the South African elections. And if there's a country in Africa that I get very, very depressed about, it's actually not Nigeria. I get depressed about South Africa, because just as Jack Straw was saying, the advent of the APC here means that you're guaranteed of strong opposition that might perhaps lead to change in government. You're going to avoid what is happening in South Africa, where one party that has dominated everything for so many years is becoming degenerate in terms of its relationship with the people. There's no longer a strong opposition. There's no longer that dynamism that comes with the possibility of change. So I'm looking forward to those elections with despondency. What I've found here in Nigeria, the dynamism has filled me with hope. I hope that you feel hopeful about your country. And I'm going to ask now for our commentators, seated in the order that they are currently seated on the platform, to make their comments about what they've heard today. So thank you very much.